Tell me about yourself.
Well, I'm Ardain Isma, like to say. I was born in a small town in the northern coast of Haiti called St. Louis. And I lived there until I was about 11. I went to primary school there. And it was customary at the time, so parents could afford it. Once a child reaches the primary school, so there was a possibility to take the child to school in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. That's what my mom did. I didn't say my father because I was listening to your previous guest. He was raised mainly by mom.
Mhm.
It was the same story for me too, because not because my dad abandoned the family, but in Haiti at that time it was necessary that husband travels to foreign land to find a
Mhm.
job to support the family back home. So growing up in the household, it was always mom taking care of us, of four of us, and sometimes things really get very things were rough. So
Mhm.
I knew exactly what he was talking about. So when I was 12, I went to Port-au-Prince for secondary school, and I stayed there until I was 17. And then at 17, I returned to my small town, St. Louis. That was the early 80s. It was also the period that where most Haitian parents try were trying to find an alternative to growing economic stagnation and difficult moment raising children. So my father was still who was living in the Bahamas wanted us, me in particular, to travel to join him.
Mhm.
But it was very difficult for mom to do that because I didn't have any paper. I just didn't have anything. So what my mother really did is to arrange for me to travel as a refugee on a boat to Miami, Florida. I was 17. It was one of the painful things that a mother could do. You just deliver your child to strangers. She knew I was going to Miami, but she also knew to get to Florida, there was a huge, vast ocean out there that her son was going to have to travel through.
Mhm.
I could see the pain in her eyes the day she turned me over to the captain.
Mhm.
It was pretty frightening for me. So, yeah, so when I arrived in Miami, which was pretty difficult moment for me, I cried all the way through Florida. So in Miami, I joined my sister who had always been living there, but I was a young refugee. I spoke no English whatsoever. But I was lucky in the sense that I was able to first live within the Haitian community, where a
Mhm.
lot of people speak the language I knew, and there was a Haitian ambience, the music and politics, and I was very fascinated with Haitian politics. So yeah, but to for many other refugees, it wasn't really an easy journey because when you leave your country to go living to a foreign country, you don't have a choice of where you're going to be living. You know. Now, when I step off that boat, I made a commitment to myself. I said I came to the United States. I wasn't really interested to live to confine myself within the Haitian community. I know it's my own. They will always love me. But to be a Haitian or Afro Haitian American, I had to find my way into the mainstream.
Mhm.
So I went to college. I lived with my sister. I went to college. I graduated from, first of all, from the community college, Miami. Just like your previous guest, I had, the benefit of receiving financial aid. And then from Miami-Dade College, I went to Baylor University, which is a Catholic institution, very pretty prestigious in South Florida. I graduated there with a degree in computer science.
mm,
And then I found out a job with American Express. They offered me to work as a computer programmer at the time, but I had just gotten married and my wife was pregnant, and I was supposed to start a job in Seattle, Washington. So my wife pretty much afraid of that. So I was grounded. So
mm,
I refused the offer. It's one of the sacrifices that I had to make, when you're married, you know you're not alone. So,
mhm,
and then I switched to education. I didn't know anything about teaching people. I was very shy. But sometimes, when things get rough and a baby in the way, I had to do what I had to do. And I became a school teacher. And ever since then, I've been married with education. It's my life. So how I became a writer, because I was always interested in writing and reading. But more so, when I was a young refugee in the streets of Miami, it was a time of the great refugee struggle. There was a very charismatic Haitian priest by the name of Gerard Jean Juste. He passed away, by the way. God bless his soul. But he was the one leading the movement. And I was able to, every day I would go there every afternoon, and I was exposed to so many intellectuals
mm,
speaking about class antagonism, speaking about racial equality, racial justice, and of course, social justice. And every time they speak, I can see myself just like they're speaking to me.
mhm.
So I said, well, I have to start putting what I'm thinking into words. So I've become fascinated with words, so I have become a writer. So yes.
It's so interesting how activism is such a motivator for a lot of our writers. You're telling your story being in Miami. Kevin was telling his story about being in New Jersey. Odessa is talking about Baltimore. We are representing our cities, but we're also so heavily influenced by the political culture, the what's happening around us, and feeling that the writing is something that's going to uplift our own community. So,
Right.
you know, I'm so happy to have you here because I am, often, well, not as often as I like, but I'm around people who were not born in this country, and I am fascinated, literally, with the story of how you got to the United States. Because I can only imagine leaving family, leaving friends, leaving what's familiar to you to
Mhm.
come to a land that you've never been to, and having to, in many ways, assimilate in order to grow, because that's just unfortunately what you have to do in these
Right.
environments. And the fact that you are able to go to school, get multiple degrees, write books. It is so fascinating. And I just want to congratulate you on that, because I don't think we say that enough. I don't think we say that enough. Um, so, for you, as someone here in a new country, dealing with and hearing about what's happening in our country, and then concerning yourself heavily about what's happening in Haiti, of
Mhm.
course. Um, what what did you feel like the writing could do to help those that you care the most about, that you left behind? Because I noticed that your stories, and please introduce your books to us, is stories that really are in the heart of Haiti.
Right, exactly. But before I get to the book, I just want to answer the direct question. Yes, I feel like uh, the Haitian story itself is deeply rooted into uh, it's just like a a fictional also a fictional story that will never end. The reason I use the word fiction is because sometimes reality seems lost.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you think that this is the bottom, it cannot go any lower, but the bottom drops. So it's just like there was always a cliffhanger for those who used to novelistic prose. So we understand when readers always have the tendency to find out what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're fascinated about the history of contemporary history of Haiti, its political turmoil, especially in the which begins in particularly with the Duvalier era, the 1950s, and effectively ends in 1986 when Baby Dog fled the country, and the subsequent military coups that followed, and then with the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1990, it's just like you go into a roller coaster. So it's pretty fresh, but you write about what you know, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
You write about the things that really transcend you the most. And for me, for anyone who reads what I write, will automatically see the situation of Haiti, or maybe my emotions sometimes cloud the objectivity that you would find in a writing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sorry, it's me, you know, because I'm a passionate when it comes to social justice.
And I know that your students benefit greatly from that. I know that you have a really strong following, especially on YouTube, with the people who follow you. I want everybody to know. So he hosts these interviews of writers, or just I think people in general. You interview them, and you're so good at it, and you have such a strong following. And I'm just so happy to have had that opportunity to meet you in that way. I tell you, I was in DR years ago, and my husband and I are there vacationing, and we noticed that all the light skinned black people, light skinned,
Right.
Dominicans were in the inside, and the dark skinned people, some which were Haitian, were working on the outside.
Hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about colorism in these two places, and how has that impacted, what have you seen? I've read the history of it, I know where it comes from, but talk to us a little bit about colorism in the country.
Well, very good question. Very interesting question. Um, the history between the Dominican Republic and Haiti is a history deeply rooted in what you call geostrategic politics.
Mhm.
To know that Haiti became independent in 1804, and doing so made it possible for the whole world to understand that Black people indeed are smart, are powerful, so powerful that they can defeat simultaneously
Mhm.
the three greatest powers of the universe at that time. They defeated the Spaniards, they defeated the British, and ultimately they defeated Napoleon in Haiti, and made it possible for the United States to purchase Louisiana.
Mhm. Mhm.
But at that time, the eastern side of the island was still controlled by the French. So what the Haitian government did is to invade the eastern side of the island to make sure to erase any trace or any possibility of a French invasion in the newly independent republic. So until 1870, the eastern part of the island was named Spanish Haiti. In fact, the independence of the Dominican Republic was signed in Port-au-Prince. So the Dominicans themselves, to this day, they never really rest with the idea independence was conceived from Haiti. And because you know that the slavery in the eastern side of the island was not as harsh as on the western side of the island, so there were more intermarriage between Europeans
Mhm.
and blacks. So as a result, you had a more majority of mixed race Dominicans in that side of the island than you really would have on the western side of the island. So the population group and the Dominicans really, especially contemporary history of the Dominican Republic, they never had a history of resistance, I would say. Resistance only against Haitian authorities because they were occupied by Haiti. And also many historians, Michelle, say that one of the greatest mistakes that Haiti really made was to rule the Dominicans as subjects, but not as equal citizens.
Mm.
So they resented that. And because Haitian, as most Haitian, or the majority of the Haitian population, have the darker skin than light-skinned Black Dominicans, so they used this as an advantage to, in other words, they used an anti-Haitianism to build a Dominican
Mm.
nationalism.
Mm.
We have to agree that they were very successful at doing so. And because of the US occupation of Haiti for 19 years, from 1915 to 1934, so Haiti's industrial development really had to be put in the back burner due to racism and all kind of thing. So the country really actually regressed while the Dominican progress. So this is where this disparity between the two nations will account. A hatred for Haiti for having been the occupier for more than 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they were able to transform their economic condition. There are many, many books. As a matter of fact, one of the greatest novel ever written on that tragedy between Haitian and Dominicans was written by a Haitian scholar by the name Jacques Stephen Alexis, who wrote a book titled Compère Général Soleil, but the English version is General Son, My Brother, where in that book give you a vivid account on a massacre that took place on the eastern part of the island under the brutal dictatorship of a Dominican president called by the name Leonidas Trujillo. He massacred more than 40,000 Haitians who were living in between the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He wanted to make sure that uh, there was no mistake that Haitian domination would never be repeated on the eastern side of the.
Mm.
So
Such,
yeah,
wow, such an
yeah.
amazing history. Such an amazing
Exactly.
history.
So it's really sad.
Mhm. Such an amazing history. I was so happy to see, and I won't go into all the details of it, but Barbados. I'm sorry, yeah, Barbados becoming its own country, and
Yeah.
I've been there, and that is such a beautiful land. And when you're somewhere and you're seeing Black people on money, it does something to you. To see a Black face on a dollar bill, or whatever the money is called there, it does something to you. So I'm glad to hear you talk about this history, a history that I don't think we hear enough about. I really do. We wanted to talk though about a couple of things that about books and how those books have influenced Black culture. And you and I, we were kind of going around about what are we going to talk about. And I said, this title of How Black Stories of the Past and Present Have Empowered Black Culture. You are a historian and you bring so much of that to this conversation. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the books that really influenced you, not just as a writer, but even as an educator? Black books or books written by people of African descent that have really influenced how you see the world and how you grow as a writer.
All right. I would say I would start with this one, The Equality of Human Races.
Mhm.
And this book was published in 1885 by a great Haitian scholar by the name Antonio Firmin. And what really influenced me is how he defeated This book is a classic rebuttal or to European racism or white supremacy. It was a direct response to uh, Count Arthur de Gobineau, dubbed as the godfather of European racism. He published in 1855 this book called The Inequality of Human Races.
Mm.
Now, what he wanted to do, or in this book, is to prove the black is a black man is inferior because of his physical trait, also because of physical skull. They use a craniometric and a biometric.
Mm.
He said he used the Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, and he presented them in two different, three different pictures. And slave owners in the south of the United States immediately jumped on it to prove their point that black people only belong to one place, into slavery.
Mm.
So Feynman proved to them in this book, it was the first scientific rebuttal to European racism. He proved it point by point, saying that if you're not educated, it's because you have not been exposed to education.
Hmm.
It's not because of your race. It's not because of some crazy notion that your cranium or intellect is reduced, is limited because of the fact that you are black. So this book really has a tremendous impact on me.
Mm.
So much so, and I wasn't alone in this particular view. This is also a work of anthropology. And in the 1900, when they congregated in London for the great first Pan-African conference, he had to be called to be one of the main organizers of this meeting. It was the first time black intellectuals from across the world, from Africa, from the Caribbean, and the United States converged in London to build a framework from which black will now start working together to make sure that every black person on this earth is exposed to some form of education. And I don't want to mention, if you want to, I can mention the name of the American delegation in London back and in the first conference. These are the names that I'm sure you already know, that Du Bois was there, and he was given the task to write, to draft an important document titled Address to the Nation of the World, in which they said in 1900, black people represent half of the world population, and it was a great disservice to humanity to deny a black a person, period, the such an important thing as education because of the fact that because of his race.
Mm.
But also we had this pastor. His name was Alexander Walters from the AME Zion Church. He was the one who was given the task for the opening ceremony. And the U.S. delegation was a very large one too. And so, yeah. So his book really, it is the book that really changed my view of the world. Also, empower me to start using my pain also to
Mm.
enhance the cause of social justice and racial justice.
That is excellent. That is excellent. The first book I thought of that I feel like helped to um, empower me as an African American was the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Uh-huh.
That I was 13 years old,
Uh-huh.
and I had a friend a boy actually, who liked me, who challenged me to read the book.
But
And
that, that's
yeah,
interesting.
right. And I wanted to make him think I was an intellectual. So I read this book, and to see what Malcolm X went through, how he overcame so many obstacles in order to be the type of leader that was about empowerment in a whole. He was the first time I heard someone talk about more of collective economics, that we need to build our own communities. Now they may
Uh-huh.
say buy the block. I
Uh-huh.
say, these were ideas coming from Garvey, Marcus Garvey, as well as from from Malcolm X. And that book really encouraged me in many ways. I began to understand more about the Muslim faith. I began to read about it. I began to better understand the evolution of a person going from, as Kevin Powell was talking about, you
Mhm.
grow up in poverty, and
Mhm.
those types of things that you learn in poverty stick with you. If
Mhm.
you learn, if you were around crime and abuse, it's something that is kind of embedded in you. You begin
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
use those same tactics as you get older until you
Mhm.
become smart enough to understand that those are no good. That's a toxic way of doing things.
Right.
Um, but poverty plants those seeds, and watching Malcolm X evolve as a man
Mhm.
taught me a great deal about my own evolution of life. And so that book was one of the first. Now, the book that you mentioned, the idea that through history, Black people have had to prove that we're good enough. I mean, that's,
Isn't that something? Isn't that something?
I think about that every time I think about I think about that every time I think about the George Floyd case.
Mhm.
If I watched every day of that hearing against the police officer, and to me, what they were trying to do, the hurdle that they had to overcome was proving that he was a man worthy of living.
Mhm.
That was so interesting to me. They brought his girlfriend on. They people saying he was a nice guy. I understand that can be a tactic in the courtroom, but it felt like the world, they were trying to prove that he deserved what he got because he was a Black man, because he had a drug problem. And so when you were talking about your book and these hearings of people coming together like Dubois, who I love, growing up, I read a lot about him. Although he was controversial, and people now are, probably debating the talented tenth and his theories on that, but that's a whole nother session.
Mhm.
But this idea of us having to prove that we're worthy, that we're still in many ways having to prove that we're worthy. So I love the book. Show your books again. I want to make sure
This is
everyone
the
gets a
book
chance
that
to see that.
really influenced me, The
Mhm.
Equality of Human Races. Yeah.
The equality of human races.
Human Races by
Excellent.
Antonio Fiamma.
Excellent.
Yeah. So yeah. And also he collaborated with Douglas when Douglas became the first U.S. first consul in Port-au-Prince, and in essence, the first U.S. ambassador to Haiti.
Hmm.
And the United States wanted to seize a piece of Haitian territory to uh, to put a U.S. military base there, and the Haitian government opposed to the idea. And the U.S. ambassador in Port-au-Prince, who was Frederick Douglass, collaborated with Fermin, who was the foreign minister, and stave off the U.S. Ambition in Haiti. It was after that fact that the government of Washington recalled Frederick Douglass, and he never returned to Haiti after this incident. But
Mm.
thanks to him and Fermi, the U.S. government was not able to do so. Yeah.
Fascinating. Absolutely. So, what book helped to influence you as you moved into manhood? What other books?
Yeah. That other book really that influenced me. I was about 20 years old at the time, and I read this book titled uh, The Masters of the Jews. And this was
Mhm.
translated by Langston Hughes and Jamaican scholar, I don't remember his name, but the original version was in French, written by Haitian. Um, he was a leader of the Negritude movement, which is Black Renaissance, Black, and in essence, it was Black power, Black intellectuals got together, and he wrote this. It's not a very condensed book, but the story between the covers is so compelling. Which was class antagonism. It's called the Gouverneur de la Rosée in French, but the Masters of the Jew. I read this book so many times. It was translated in more than 50 languages. And every time I read this book, I cry in the end. Till now, not just the prose, but it's the story. I could see myself into it.
Mhm.
Anybody. Whether you live in the ghettos of somewhere, some big cities, or whether you live in a disenfranchised place in the country, you can still see yourself after reading it. Yes.
I I think the book that did that for me as I matured into a young woman was Maya Angelou's book, The Heart of a Woman, which my first book is called The Heart of a Man, which is, you
I
know,
know, I know. We talked about that. Yeah.
but The Heart of a Woman was one of her many books that takes you through her life and the consequences of life. She's going through divorces, she's becoming an actress, she's a singer, she's so dynamic and she
Uh-huh.
overcame so much. But that book is one that I've read at every stage of my life because
Uh-huh.
I read it when I was in college. I was probably too young to really understand and appreciate it. And then I had to
Okay.
read it later in life. And it was
Mm.
something that, I love her poetry, but I still think that her books are fantastic. And as a woman coming of age, people should read all of them. Her entire life story that she
Mhm.
put out there,
Mhm.
and that is something that's so dynamic. I also love Kendrick, and it's so funny because
Mhm.
I read this book also. I think I was in high school. Octavia Butler, who just made the New York Times best-selling list with her book collection. She died in 2000, I think 2009, and
Mhm.
been writing for probably 50 years before. But because she's African American and she's writing sci-fi, she could not make the bestsellers list until I think it was 2020 that she
Okay.
did. And
Okay.
so this is a book where the main character is going to sleep and waking up as a slave. I mean, dreaming of being a slave and
Mhm.
going through that process, every night. And it made me think about the fact that how could I have lived through slavery? Like we always say that. I
Mhm.
don't think I could have made it through slavery. Well, for 200 years, our people did make it
Yeah.
through slavery. Some made it, some didn't, and it was
Right.
horrific.
Right.
But there was obviously something that was driving us to succeed, to move forward, to keep going. And when we think about it now, so many of us would say, I wouldn't have done this. I would have been a rebel. I would, but you got to understand the amount of fear that we all lived under in that time and that we have been taken from our own country and
Mhm.
brought here. And that's why I said I have so much love and respect
Right.
for people like you who weren't born here, who came here and had to live and learn to live in this in our world,
Mhm.
and also love your own. Like I love that every book and everything you talk about is about Haiti because
Mhm.
I know that's where your heart is. Have you
Right.
gone back there? Have you gone back there?
The last time I've been to Haiti was back in 2005, 2005. I had just released my first novel, Alicia, and I wanted to make sure that some friends back in Haiti had a chance to have a copy. I
Hmm.
did a little presentation there, and I visited my hometown, my small town, and quite a change. For the many years I've been living in the United States, I still had in my mind that small town that I left on one summer night back in 1980. But the town quite changed. There was a demographic explosion, but
Hmm.
I felt so. I was at home. You
Yeah.
know, yeah. When I went to see my grandma and all those folks, and they were so happy to see me. Yeah. It was a very very nice feeling. Yeah, and ever since then, I have not been able to go
I
back.
know your heart is in Haiti because you talk everything that the way the tone in, the sound of your voice when you talk about Haiti. I
You
know that your
appreciate it.
heart is there.
But Midnight at Noon also has Haiti in it from the get go. So from the beginning to the end, and Really, everyone who reads the story Midnight at Noon,
Hmm.
they tend to fall in love with Haiti, or at least with that part of the country that I described so much so emotionally. But in the reality, this book is a political novel. You
Hmm.
know, sometimes I get the impression that the politics seems to have lost and the prose, because I've seen the folks in my neighborhood. I know they some of them are Republicans, and they read the story, so they came back to me and to say how lovely the story is.
Hmm.
And my wife and I said, I think we're free. They overlooked the political undertone of the story.
Absolutely. I understand. They're going to read it again now. They're going to watch this and they're going to go back and read it again. And they're like, oh, now we get it. So before we wrap up, because gosh, we only have another 7 minutes of this event, and I've
Okay.
got to wrap up with the authors. I just want to give you an opportunity to tell us again the name of your book and to leave us a little nugget of a tip, something that as writers we can take with us to know that we need to continue to write. That's what I hope that you'll be able to give us.
Okay. All right. So I began with the book. It's titled Midnight at Noon. It took me 5 years to write. It's a political novel depicting ever the never ending legacy of Haitian struggle to emerge into the industrial world. The country's misery, the question of class, while in the United States we're going through racial struggle, but in Haiti is a class struggle, is a fight for social political power.
Mhm.
So you will find all this between the covers of Midnight at Noon. So yeah, as far as leaving something, uh, it's always tough for me when people ask me the question. But I always take myself as an example. Writing can shake soul. Writing revolutionized societies. But if you really want to be a writer or a storyteller, you need to be true to yourself.
Mhm. Mhm.
Just like the previous guest say, even if you know that it's going to be you and close friends and relatives who will read it, write it. Because while pictures fade over time, words can live 1,000 years.
Mhm.
If you see, you can write a story throughout your lifetime, nobody pays attention to it. Maybe 50 years after you pass, that's when people begin to see the logic and the power and the message behind the book. So keep writing because writing can shake soul. And also, I just want to say this uh, knowledge is important. Always empower yourself with education because those who know always lead. But if you don't, most likely you'll be a follower.
Mhm.
Education is power, just like knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. Excellent words to leave on. Thank you so much for being with us. I wish we had more time. I'm going to bring you on again so we can talk more about your books. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing for the Black Writers Workspace, for interviewing our winners of the competition, for interviewing me. You have a great platform, and you are such an amazing historian with such a love for your country. And we all see that. And I'm definitely going to pick up your books and go and read them both.
Okay.
And I just wanted to tell you again, thank you, and thank you to your wife and your family for everything that they have done as well to help mold you into such a great writer and such a great teacher. And
I know.
okay, I appreciate you, and we're going to be wrapping up the event shortly.
It
Take
was
care.
lovely. It's always a pleasure to have
Always.
you.
Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.
So, everyone, we are down to the last couple of minutes of the event. For those of you who are still